Okay, so my name is Henk Huizer. I'm at QUT. This is TELedvisors Special Interest Group Webinar, Educational Technology, Student Equity, and the Role of Third Space Professionals. So we're lucky to have Zhiqiang Amos Tay today, as well as Dr. Anita Wielden. We'll start with Amos, and I'll just get Amos to share his screen. And before we do, I would also like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'm in Mianjin, and so traditional owners of this country. So first of all, Amos is a teacher and a PhD candidate who's almost finished. His primary supervisor is Professor Abby Cathcart, and I'm his associate supervisor. His thesis has been examined, and he's making some final small changes to it. And his thesis is called Examining the Impact of Learning Technologies on Social Justice in Higher Education. So what Amos will be presenting today is based on a journal article that is part of his thesis. So over to you, Amos.
Thanks, Hank, for the introduction. Thank you again for coming to this webinar. I would first like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara as the First Nations owners of where I am at now at the campus grounds of QUT. I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So like what Hank said, this webinar is based on a recently published research that is part of my PhD thesis by publication. Okay, so the rise in the global learning technology market meant that there's a growing trend of adopting learning technologies in higher education. So this chart illustrates how the learning technology market is going to continue to grow over time, which means that higher education, there will be higher levels of learning technologies being adopted and used by teaching academics, students, learning designers, which also means that there's a demand for learning designers, with online learning becoming an essential part of the learning experience at universities. Instructional designers or learning designers, as what we term in my research, are instrumental to supporting the university within this learning and teaching space. So the increasing integration of learning technologies has induced an increase in demand for learning designers, coupled with the COVID pandemic. It has resulted in an accelerated transition towards using learning technologies. The learning and teaching space used to be an exclusive domain for teaching academics who are largely responsible for the pedagogical approach and design of their units. And they are supposed to be more or less in charge in terms of shaping the learning and teaching space. But with the increased employment of learning designers who are brought in to construct pedagogical innovations through the use of learning technologies, and also to provide support to teaching academics to use learning technologies. This learning and teaching space is increasingly shared between teaching academics and learning designers. So a key part to understanding this shared learning and teaching space is to understand how these two stakeholders understand learning technology. And so there has been much research interest in understanding the relationship between these two stakeholders. Prior research has talked about the value of collaboration in the learning and teaching space between these two stakeholders. But however, complexities of learning and teaching involving these two stakeholders remain under research. So prior research, for example, where they talk about how teaching academics were unclear about the roles that learning designers play, reflected an underlying tension that needs to be uncovered. So a key research question for my study is, how has the learning and teaching process been influenced by the combined input of teaching academics and learning designers in the Australian higher education context? Okay, for the research design, my research utilized the critical realist positioning that accepts that much of reality exists independent of our knowledge and awareness, and that the knowledge of the world is mediated and constructed through language, as well as the presence of underlying mechanisms and structures. Using critical theory as the interpretive framework has allowed the analysis to be done by looking at reality that is known through the study of social structures and underlying power relations. The mode of research inquiry, a case study research, a major Australian university was selected as a case study as it represented different stakeholders who has experience in using learning technologies in the learning and teaching space. So the sample size, there are 12 teaching academics and 5 learning designers recruited based on the purposeful sampling method that allow for the recruitment of participants based on a set criteria so as to provide rich insights into the research topic. The data collection is based on semi-structured interviews involving the use of a mix of more or less structured interview questions, as well as allowing space for new ideas from the perspective of the two participant groups. In terms of data analysis, this study utilized Foucauldian discourse analysis as the analytical framework to conduct the analysis of the collected data to address the research question of this study. Like I mentioned, participants were recruited based on criteria, which is they either have taught in online or blended undergraduate courses for teaching academics, or they have supported them for learning designers. So for teaching academics, they come from a range of different disciplines such as education, engineering, business, and science. And there are a total of 5 learning designers. Okay, so for data collection, the semi-structured interviews were similar for each group participant. The broad question is about asking them for factors that influence the adoption and use of learning technologies in higher education. So the idea is to probe them for factors that could either promote or inhibit the adoption and use of learning technologies. And depending on what their responses, I'll then probe them more to elaborate on their responses. And the duration of the interviews, as you can see, for both participant groups is approximately an hour long. Yes, so 5 discourses emerged from the data. The first being centralization, surveillance, institutional homogenization, responsibility, and efficiency. So please let me just highlight a few. Let me briefly talk through each of these discourses, as well as a couple of key quotes that reflected what the discourse is about. So for centralization, it is related to not just the centralization of learning technologies, but also the centralization of support services by learning designers. So within this discourse, there were clear contradictions in terms of how teaching academics and learning designers perceive this discourse of centralization. For example, this first quote reflected the paradoxical dilemma teaching academics face when learning technologies are centralized, as in, while there could be this idea of centralization of technologies embedded within practices of centralization of resources and resource allocation, but at the same time, they also see how this could stifle pedagogical innovations. On the other hand, for learning designers, they were quoted as sort of discouraging the use of learning technologies that were not institutionally supported. And basically, they are more keen towards promoting the use of institutionally supported learning technologies. There are reasons in terms of data security, which for teaching academics, they prioritize the relevance to their pedagogy, as opposed to how learning designers felt being institutionally supported is more important. For surveillance, it was through the adoption and use of learning technologies that afforded this hierarchical observation of teaching academics as well as students. So both participant groups demonstrated an acute awareness that the use of learning technologies created affordances for greater scrutiny of staff and student behaviors. So for example, there's this teaching academic who highlighted this experience in a live stream tutorial where there was this hierarchical observation of what the tutorial is going on, and they could just kind of intrude into the tutorial itself, and this particular teaching academic felt that it was there was a sense of panoptic surveillance. But by contrast, learning designers generally perceived learning technologies adoption and use as being able to create conditions that allowed for observation as being productive, as a form of relationship building, a community of practice, and which is different from how teaching academics perceive this sense of surveillance. Within the discourse of institutional homogenization, there were practices that were geared towards homogenizing the use of institutionally supported learning technologies, while discouraging the use of alternative, non-institutionally supported learning technologies. So, for example, for the first quote by a teaching academic, when asked what factors influence the adoption and use of learning technologies, this particular teaching academic quoted, expressed how there is a sense of normalization in terms of what and how learning technologies should be used, which is increasingly geared towards using institutionally supported ones. Like in this quote, they used to have greater autonomy to choose the types of learning technologies, but there's a gradual shift towards institutional homogenization of what kind of learning technologies they should and can use. For learning designers, however, most of the learning designers in this study voiced support for the adoption of institutionally supported learning technologies. So they talk about the need to have an established set of institutional technologies to be used, and discouraging teaching academics not to use non-institutionally supported ones. The discourse of responsibility is about who is responsible for the decision-making and who has agency. So while teaching academics and learning designers shifted responsibility to students for the use of learning technologies, learning designers also asserted that it was the responsibility of teaching academics to adopt and use learning technologies. So for teaching academics, you can see that they sort of shifted responsibility to use learning technologies to students because of how prevalent learning technologies are. They felt that students are expected to be able to use learning technologies for their learning. But at the same time, for learning designers, they have stated that it is also the responsibility of teaching academics who have to learn and teach themselves how to use certain learning technologies for learning and teaching. This next quote reflects a clear tension in terms of how learning designers could hierarchize certain learning technologies, especially for teaching academics who want to use non-institutionally supported learning technologies, calling them such technologies as rogue technologies. So in this way, learning designers were using their professional expertise in design knowledge, as well as their professional identity as learning designers, as design experts, to exert influence over what and how learning technologies should be used by teaching academics. And for the last discourse, for efficiency, teaching academics talked about being time deficit stemming from increased academic workload to learn how to use learning technologies, while at the same time learning designers talk about it is through the use of learning technologies that could be a solution to this problem about time deficit. So for example, teaching academics were quoted saying that it takes time to learn how to use learning technologies, and it is to them counterproductive if learning technologies were meant to reduce the time for assessment, to mark, or to teach, but at the same time, there's not enough time for them to learn how to use these learning technologies. And yeah, like I said, for learning designers, they are using the idea of learning technologies to help teaching academics to be more proficient and efficient as well in terms of their time usage, to learn how to use learning technologies for learning and teaching. At the same time, there are also some learning designers who recognize that this time deficit issue is a common problem among teaching academics, and how having a learning designer working with them useful in facilitating the teaching academics development to learn to use learning technologies. So for discussion, this study aimed to explore how teaching academics and learning designers understand learning technology in the context of a large Australian university. So the findings revealed 5 contested but interconnected discourses that reflected how the two stakeholders engaged with learning technologies. So there was this idea of centralization of learning technologies, as well as their support services could be enmeshed within policies related to resource allocation that requires policing. And it is this form of policing that some teaching academics felt could stifle innovation. But for learning designers, the discourses of centralization, surveillance, and institutional homogenization were opportunities for learning designers to not only promote the use of institutionally supported learning technologies, but it was also a strategy or a way to build collaborative relationships when they talk about how using certain learning technologies could, and having them having the ability to have an overview of what teaching academics were doing through the use of learning technologies could build a community of practice. And like I said, for surveillance through the use of learning technologies could be productive, at the same time repressive for teaching academics, while they know that using learning technologies could induce a climate of surveillance, but they know that through the use of learning technologies, it could also allow them to observe students and monitor students' progress in their learning. In terms of efficiency and responsibility, I think there is a need for more time to be allocated to teaching academics, for them to develop their capability to learn to use learning technologies. And both participant groups acknowledge that it is in their mutual interest to use learning technologies in a collaborative manner within the learning and teaching space, in order to overcome the challenges faced by teaching academics. So for conclusion, in conclusion, discourses of centralization, surveillance, institutional homogenization, responsibility, and efficiency, it reflects the dynamic nature of the learning and teaching space, and it requires a constant constant process of renegotiation between the two stakeholders, so as to ensure a meaningful collaboration based on trust. So an important implication of this study is for universities to develop learning technologies, policies that prioritize the collaborative aspect of the design process, and to have policies that that put structures in place to allow for this collaboration. Like, for example, learning designers could be attached to a specific faculty to provide a more personalized support for teaching academics. And like I said, for the different discourses being identified through this research, it reflects the tensions, the underlying tensions involving the use of learning technologies between the two stakeholders, which presents as an opportunity to then develop and implement practices and policies to overcome the different tensions. Yes, so for future research, like what I mentioned, there's a need to then investigate how these different interventions that may reduce the tensions within the identified discourses could achieve a more collaborative and productive relationship, as well as the impact of these policies on this collaboration, and by extension, the student learning experience. Yes, so this is the reference to my recently published research. So if you want to read more about it, you can just go to the URL there. And these are the references. Yes. So thank you once again, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Amos. And thanks. That's a great presentation. I'm just a bit conscious of the time because we started a bit late, and apologies for that. There's a lot of there are a lot of very interesting questions in the chat. So if you could go through and try and answer some of those while Anita gets started.